Ever feel like elections are well, more complicated than they seem on the surface? Like,
Right.
we focus so much on who to vote for, but what about the how? The
Mhm.
actual systems behind those votes? That's what we're digging into today, specifically in the context of India.
Pulling from Indian Constitution at Work, that chapter on election and representation, so
It
fascinating.
really gets you thinking, and I love that chess analogy they use.
Oh yeah, how changing the rules changes the whole game.
Exactly. And elections are a game, in a way, right? Strategic with consequences.
Absolutely. And just like in chess, those rules, the electoral system itself, can be as important as who the players are.
Totally. Today's deep dive is all about giving you that extra layer of understanding because it's not always intuitive.
No, not at all. A seemingly small tweak to a system can have huge ripple effects on the whole political landscape.
And while our focus is India, these ideas are super relevant globally.
Right. The text even brings up how countries like Israel and the Netherlands have wrestled with very similar questions about how they run elections.
Okay, so let's get specific then. India's system, first past the post. Sounds simple on the surface.
It does, but there's a lot to unpack there. Basically, it means in each district, whoever gets the most votes wins.
Okay, makes sense.
But here's the thing. They don't necessarily need a majority of all the votes, just more than anyone else running.
Hold on, so you could win with, say, 40% of the votes as long as no one else got more?
Exactly.
Wow, okay. And that's not just theoretical, huh?
Not at all. Look at the 1984 Lok Sabha election, right? Congress had this huge win, over 80% of the seats.
Dominated.
But their actual vote share, the text has this table, it's kind of shocking, they only got 48% of the total votes.
Really? So way more seats than their percentage of the vote would suggest.
Exactly. And that's a big critique of first past the post, right? What happens to all those other votes for candidates who didn't win?
Yeah, like, do they even matter?
That's the wasted votes argument you hear a lot. Your vote doesn't directly translate to the makeup of the government, even if your candidate got a decent chunk of the votes.
Makes you wonder about strategy. If you know your first choice has no shot, do you vote for someone else just to block someone worse?
It's a dilemma a lot of voters in these systems face.
For sure. Okay, so to contrast that, let's talk about proportional representation, PR.
Okay, good idea. So with PR, the goal is to more closely align the percentage of votes a party gets with the number of seats they have.
So if a party gets 30% of the votes nationwide?
They should get roughly 30% of the seats in parliament, ideally.
Right. Makes sense. But there are different ways to actually do PR, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
That's where it gets more complex. The text gives some good examples like Israel and Portugal.
Yeah. What makes those different?
So Israel, they treat the whole country as one big constituency. You vote for a party, not a specific person.
Wow. Okay. So no single representative for like your local area.
Right. And seats are given out based on the overall vote for each party. Then you've got places like Portugal. They still use smaller districts, but each elects multiple people to parliament.
Interesting. So both aim for proportionality, just different ways of slicing that pie.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got FPTP, which India uses, and then PR with its variations. It makes you wonder, why did India go with first past the post in the first place?
It's really interesting, actually, if you think about the context, right? A brand new nation, huge, incredibly diverse.
Right, right.
And FPTP, it's pretty straightforward. That probably seemed like a good thing at the time.
Makes sense. Trying to implement some super complicated system across a newly independent nation. I mean, could you imagine?
Exactly. And this is before computers were everywhere, right? Just the logistics of counting votes, figuring out seats with the PR system, it would have been a nightmare.
Oh, for sure. So practicality was key. But was there also a feeling that maybe FPTP would lead to, like, more stable governments, especially with a parliamentary system like India's?
Absolutely. The framers of the Constitution, they were definitely worried about things falling apart. Too much division, instability, especially given how diverse India is.
Right.
They thought FTTP, with its clear winners, would be the safer bet.
But then, wouldn't that same logic also make it harder for smaller parties, or minority groups, to really gain a foothold?
That's the big debate, right? It's not that FPTP completely shuts them out, but it's definitely uphill.
Right.
They need that majority in a specific place, not just a good chunk of the overall vote.
Way harder. Although it's not like India has just two main parties, right? There are coalitions, regional parties. It gets complicated.
Totally. And that actually changes things. Those coalitions, they kind of balance out some of the limitations of FPTP, you could argue.
How so?
Well, a smaller party, they might not get enough seats on their own to, form a government.
Right.
But if they team up with a bigger party,
Right.
suddenly they have some real power.
So it's not as simple as like FPTP equals less diversity in the government.
Not at all. Which I guess is a good reminder that these electoral systems, they're not static things. They evolve, respond to the political reality on the ground.
And speaking of political reality, let's talk about reserved constituencies, which is another way India tries to ensure fair representation. The source material goes into that,
It
right?
does, yeah. It's actually a really fascinating mechanism they built right into the Constitution. It's all about addressing inequalities faced by certain communities historically.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're talking about reserving seats in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies, right?
Exactly. But for members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes.
But this isn't about separate electorates, is it?
No, no, not at all.
Like those communities only get to vote for people from their own group.
That's a really important distinction. Reserved constituencies mean anyone can run in those elections, but the candidates themselves have to be from those communities.
Got it.
But everyone votes, no matter who they are.
Which, to me, feels like a powerful statement.
Mhm.
It's about making sure those groups who've been marginalized historically have a real voice
Mm-hmm.
and that they're not just like sidelined into this whole other system.
Right. And it was a tough decision. I mean, the source material even quotes Jaypal Singh, who is this prominent Adivasi leader.
Yeah.
He fought really hard against separate electorates during the debates about the Constitution. And his words are powerful, he said. We're willing to mix with you and have insisted on a reservation of seats. We have not asked for separate electorates.
It really shows you how much they wanted to be included, to be part of the whole.
It's about recognizing those historical wrongs, but also striving for a unified nation, a tough needle to thread.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the legacy of those decisions, Trying to build a system that's fair, that represents everyone. It's an ongoing process, right?
Totally. And those debates are definitely not over, not by a long shot. Even with reserved constituencies, like we were just talking about, there's still the question of women's representation, which is huge.
It's kind of wild when you think about it. There's no law requiring a certain number of women in the Lok Sabha.
Right.
And we're talking about, what, over half the population?
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of why these systems matter.
Yeah.
If they don't actually reflect the people they're supposed to represent, it creates blind spots.
Like literally, whose voices are we not hearing? Whose experiences aren't being considered when policies are made?
It has real consequences.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the system on paper either. The source material talks about how important it is to make sure elections are actually free and fair.
Like you can have good rules, but someone's got to enforce them.
Exactly. And that's where India's election commission comes in.
Okay, they're the referees, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly. They're independent, which is huge.
Yeah.
Meaning they don't answer to any particular party or politician. They're there to protect the process itself.
So they can actually stand up and say, nope, not okay, if someone's trying to rig the game.
Yep. The text even mentions they can postpone elections if there's violence or interference.
Wow, that's serious power.
It shows they're serious about integrity. And it highlights how important strong institutions are to a democracy. Not just having good intentions.
Totally. But there's always room for improvement, right? What are people talking about when it comes to electoral reform in India these days?
Well, for one, there's the whole FPTP versus PR debate, which we touched on earlier. So people think switching to proportional representation would make things more fair.
Less those wasted votes we were talking about.
Right, exactly. And of course, there's the ongoing push for better representation for women, whether it's reserved seats or some other approach.
Right. Gotta have that. What else?
Well, the influence of money in politics is a big one. Always comes up.
Campaign finance, that kind of thing.
Like stricter limits, maybe even state-funded elections, the goal being to level the playing field a bit.
So everyone has a fair shot, not just the super rich.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got the whole issue of keeping things ethical, making sure criminals aren't infiltrating the system.
Right, which is a whole other can of worms, I'm sure. It does feel like there's no easy answer,
Yeah, no quick fixes. The text makes that really clear. A democracy as complex as India's, it needs constant attention, evaluation, adaptation.
What's a work in progress always will be.
Right. Which is why it's so important for people to be engaged, to pay attention, hold their leaders accountable.
To actually participate in their democracy.
Exactly. It's not a spectator sport. You got to be in the game.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What role will you play in shaping the future of democracy wherever you are? It's a question worth thinking about.